Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of R-Rated, where today we're looking at the 5th episode of Moon Knight Asylum. I didn't throw a little cold open in because this one's going to be kind of hard to talk about. If you've seen the episode, there's definitely some things that you'll be aware of already that are going to make this a little bit tricky to discuss with any real levity. And if you haven't, maybe go watch the episode. I highly recommend it. It's a solid episode, and if not, then buckle up. The framing that we wind up getting for this episode is sort of it's actually a little bit strange. So we explicitly have this framing device of the memories of Marc Spector and Stephen Grant, but they're all contained in one place, which is like, oh, okay, so how are they going to be interwoven and interconnected together? And the location they're actually in is not imagined, which is kind of the strange part. At the end of the previous episode, it seemed like the psych ward and the hallway, that Mark wound up running down and then finding Steven in and all of that stuff. It seemed like that was all part of one collective sort of vision, and it sort of is. It's still a little bit unclear to me, but we at least have two quasi-distinct zones that this episode is taking place in. We have the ship, which I don't think it actually got a name, but the ship of Taweret. I'm gonna horribly mangle that name over and over again. The Egyptian goddess that is essentially ferrying Mark and Stephen to the afterlife, where either they will spend the rest of eternity in the field of reeds in utopia and peace, or they will be thrown into the sands of the Duat, where they will just freeze, and that will be where they are forever. And the place where Mark and Steven are kind of interacting with each other is essentially inside of the ship. The ship's interior takes on a form that is familiar to the ones who are going to the other side, essentially. We also find out, for what it's worth, that so before anyone jumped in to be like, oh, so this is the canonical afterlife of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it's like, yes and no. Taweret is pretty clear about, like, well, it's an afterlife. There's a whole bunch of them, and it turns out she's actually a big fan of the ancestral plane of the goddess Bast and Wakanda and all of that, which is kind of a neat little thing there that I guess especially the ferrymen of the various afterlives are familiar with the other related realms and things. I think that's kind of neat. But so we have essentially a big hallway, a big psych ward, essentially, in this case, because Mark pretty plainly is like, because we're insane. We've lost our minds. We're broken mentally. So it has formed into a psych ward for them together. And each of these doors is filled with memories from their lives. It's a little bit complicated. But essentially, it's especially the troubling stuff that is kind of difficult to overcome. The thing that determines whether or not they're going to survive to the afterlife or not is the balancing of scales. So we're seeing that scale balancing iconography coming back. So Arthur Harrow has the scale tattoo on his forearm, and here Taweret actually has a physical scale where she puts the heart of the person being judged onto it, along with a feather of truth, I guess. So on the scales of justice, the feather of truth. And if they are balanced, then congratulations, you go to the field of reeds. And if not, into the sands you go. So it's interesting that visual is kind of coming back, that is still happening there. And I'd be curious to know why Arthur Harrow essentially has functionally that as his own ability. He's been able to before, if your scales were balanced or were balanced correctly, then you were allowed to live and continue to be one of his disciples. But if they weren't, then you just fell over dead immediately, which is very similar to what happens if your if you're unbalanced here in the duet. So that's all well and good, and I am going to come back to that in a sec. But the other major location that we have in this episode is essentially this is clearly some kind of mental space. Unclear how much it exists among or outside or inside of Marc Spector and Stephen Grant's minds, but it appears it takes on the shape and the form of a psychiatrist's office in a psych ward, where Arthur Harrow is the doctor, he's the administrator that's there. Mark/Stephen are his patients. But it gets pointed out by one of them. I think it actually gets pointed out by Harrow that the room, maybe it wasn't Harrow, that the room essentially looks like the tomb that he was just in when he got shot. It's a very similar shape, similar architecture, the kind of like brick wall aesthetic that's going on in the background. And when we first pop back in here, Mark is like bloodied and beaten and stuff, and he's got like it looks like a bandaged up nose, like he had a cut. Eventually he gets an injection and it throws him back to the ship. And later on, Mark winds up going back to the office again. Like he just kind of jumps back and forth. He's in the office again with a thing of water. Eventually Steven winds up, kind of breaking out a little bit, and then he has control. And it's interesting because the way the previous episode worked, you kind of inherently distrust Harrow because he's Harrow, and it feels like it's some kind of weird trick. But as this episode goes on, it does seem like it's not, because my suspicion was, Harrow's doing something to Mark, and it's resulting in this. Like he's trying to interrogate him. He's trying to figure out where the Ushabti is or something. But instead, it does seem like all of the people in this asylum are sort of just various figments of Mark's consciousness in a sense, and he's just putting faces on parts of it for the sake of making it all kind of make sense. Or alternatively, it could also be a visualization of his dissociative identity disorder, where a lot of people will have like an internal monologue with themselves, and maybe this is kind of how that works for Mark, where inside of himself he just has all of these other people essentially, that live and breathe a little bit more than, you would normally expect your own consciousness or conscience to when you're kind of having a debate with yourself. But it's interesting because like I said before, in the previous episode, it seemed like Harrow was trying to extract information out of Mark. But as this episode goes on, it does seem like the character of Dr. Harrow is legitimately trying to help Mark and Steven have some kind of a breakthrough or epiphany. And that does wind up happening later on in the episode. And it's just kind of interesting. I guess that's just like a part of the recesses of Mark's mind, and he's kind of jumping back and forth because of the stress and the panic of what's going on, and learning that, yes, he is dead. Mark is currently dead as of the start of this episode. Actually, I guess as of the end of the previous episode, as he's being ferried off to the afterlife. So 2 bullets to the chest. Marc Spector died. And yeah, there's an interesting thing that I kind of realized too about what's going on with the Dr. Harrow sequence, and it actually kind of leans back into 2 things. One, it leans back into the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where Bucky was also undergoing psychiatric kind of treatment and psychological evaluation and that sort of thing. And it kind of occurs to me that after a certain point, anybody in the MCU is going to be extremely traumatized from anything that's going on in the world. That's not ultimately what is the issue with Mark, but I got to imagine there's a lot of folks with a lot of baggage and a lot of things they're trying to figure out in the wake of everything that's happened within the last 15 years in the MCU. The other thing that sort of occurred to me Nope, you know what? I lost it. I had it, and yep, I think it's just gone. I think it's just gone for now. If I'm reminded of it later, then I'll bring it back. But it had to do with some other comparisons with things going on in the MCU, but that's okay. And it's interesting that like Dr. Harrow kind of, imparts upon Mark as he's talking about like, so there's you, there's a Stephen Grant, you become a superhero, you are talking to a hippo goddess. Does that sound like sense or nonsense? And Mark agrees that it does sound like nonsense, which is interesting because, and again, this is part of why I was / still am a little bit reluctant to trust this character / figment, whatever Dr. Harrow happens to be, because maybe the idea is, Mark is aware that the world is really fucked up in the MCU and there's just tons of weird shit going on all the time, but that if he's going to actually resolve his own issues, he has to kind of strip all of that away and bring it back to the basics and be like, okay, we need to figure out you. All this other shit doesn't matter right now. Let's figure out you. And in a lot of ways, this episode is kind of two separate tracks that are kind of going at the same time. We have the kind of A plot of the episode, or I guess it's more of the B plot, once things get moving. The B plot of the episode is that Mark and Steven are trying to balance their scales in order to not be permanently killed. And the A plot, which is related, but the A plot revolves entirely around Marc Spector's memories and essentially Stephen Grant discovering the truth about the two of them and how they're related and connected. And it's a pretty heavy, it's an extremely heavy episode. It was very tough to watch in some areas, not because it was like graphic or violent or anything, but because it was really deeply hurtful stuff that goes on in the episode. Probably the not at this point, you got a pretty good suspicion of what the reality of Mark and Steven are, but early-ish into the episode, Steven goes through a door and sees a young child, and he looks up and he says, "Oh, that's my mom," and recognizes that the young boy that's there is himself, and the woman tells the child to like take care of your little brother, and he's like, "Wait, I had a brother?" And which is already kind of a big deal on its own, but more so than that, she calls the boy Mark, and Steven doesn't even flinch, doesn't blink, doesn't acknowledge it at all. She calls him Mark, and he's like, "Oh, that's my mom." And it's like, "Oh, okay, all right." So either he's already kind of accepting it, or he's just so laser focused on what else is going on. And we come to discover over the episode that Mark did have a brother, Randall, or Roro, and they went out one day, were playing in the rain, went into a cave, went too deep, and the cave flooded, and Randall died. And they were probably like, 7, 8, 9, somewhere around there. Obviously a really tragic thing to have happen, and something that Mark really didn't want to have to remember again, and he actively tried to stop Steven from going back and reliving those memories, and it kind of seems like when he's doing that, Mark is kind of actively remembering them at the same time, because obviously a lot of the stuff that's going on is a little more abstract and figurative than literal, and we kind of jump around a little bit forward bit by bit, where we go to the Shiva, I think is the term for it. It's from a really super cursory glance at this, I'm not super familiar with it, but it's essentially like a Jewish period of mourning. It's like a week-long wake kind of deal, paying respects for the dead, and during that, the mother completely like loses it and flips out on Mark and essentially starts screaming at him that it's his fault. He's the reason that Randall's dead. Just loses it on this, I think, 9-year-old boy. which is not so great. So we've already got a certain degree of, and like, she's mourning, obviously. She's in really extreme emotional pain. So, like, there's a certain level of, not like that's okay, but you could understand how someone could lash out like that in a moment of, like, extreme emotion. But then we keep flashing forward, and here's Mark's 10th birthday, and she doesn't even come down to celebrate. His dad, sits there with him with the cake, but she doesn't even come downstairs. And for his 12th birthday, she does come downstairs, but then basically tells Mark to his face, like, oh, you were always jealous of him. This is all, this is what you wanted, wasn't it? And he rightfully is upset and runs away. And we again jump ahead to him as a teenager, like, leaving home. He's just kind of done with it because he's been putting up with this for, like, most of his life at this point. He's just kind of done. And he joins the military, but he goes into, like, fugue states. And it's clear that by the time he's left home, he's already having, like, weird dissociative moments, and he's not entirely in control of himself. And it kind of messes him up, and it is the reason that he becomes a mercenary, and it's the reason that he winds up at the dig site of Layla's father. It's the reason why he then becomes the avatar of Khonshu, and it all kind of comes back together. In fact, as we're being introduced to these memories in the first place, it's kind of like, think of like hospital doors with a big square window. You can look through and you can see all these various memories. And one of them that we see, the first one we see is actually Moon Knight beating the shit out of the jackal from the first episode. The second one we see is from, the third episode, I think, when Khonshu and Steven move the stars to locate the tomb. And then the third one we see is just Mark standing next to a car with a flask, just drinking out of the flask and standing there. We don't really get a lot of context for that, and we kind of go through all of these various motions, and we wind up coming back around to that eventually. First, we wind up seeing kind of the truth of all of this, which is that even when Mark and his brother are walking around, they start talking about, like, using a British accent, and it's like, oh, Russell, let's do this. Oh, yes, Dr. Grant, and like all of these things. And we find out later that in his room, he's got a poster for the movie Tomb Busters, which showed up at the end of the previous episode. It wasn't clear at the time whether that was just some kind of constructed idea of, like, oh, here's this thing, and either it's real and that's where Stephen Grant is from, essentially, or it's just some trick that's to kind of make Mark not trust anything. But as he's sitting there as a boy, he's kind of curled up, sitting next to a full-length mirror, which has been a big bit of imagery throughout the series. And up on the wall, we've got the Tomb Busters poster with Stephen Grant as the name right there on it. And as his mother starts basically banging down the door, we see for the first time as Mark kind of rolls his eyes back and entirely dissociates from what's going on. And he's like, oh, I should pick up before Mom gets in. And he's just like totally not with it anymore. And Stephen Grant is essentially born, unfortunately, very quickly followed by Mark's mother coming in and grabbing a belt and doing not so great things with that. So we've evolved from emotional and psychological abuse to just straight up physical abuse. So not great. Mark and Steven have a pretty big blowout immediately after this. Steven rightfully being like, what am I? What is all of this? What's going on? Mark trying to explain to him that, like, essentially he knew that his own life was so fucked up at that point that the only chance that anyone was going to have essentially is if he created this other persona altogether that could have a chance at living a normal life separate from all of this. And which is why, Stephen Grant works at a gift shop and he leads kind of a humdrum life and all of these things. It's like he wanted to have him be as normal as he possibly could which is why he's so averse to all of these like risks and dangers and things, and why he's such a homebody and all of these and all of these things, and including why he speaks to his mother all the time. Except the problem is his mother is actually dead and has been for a couple months now. And I thought about this, and it's like I was kind of unclear based on the way they were shooting previous scenes. The first time he talks to his mother in the show, it's pretty clear that he's like on an answering machine or something. But the second time, it does kind of sound like he's having an actual conversation with her. We ultimately get a shot in well, I'll get to that in a second, but so we get context for that shot of Mark standing and drinking by his car. He's standing across the street from his mother's Shiva, refusing to go in, walking down the street and having like a really emotional kind of outburst over all of this, and then blacks out. Stephen Grant persona comes out, pulls out his phone and calls his mom and starts talking. I forget whether he was actually talking with her or talking on the answering machine. However, they do a really good bit of cinematography with this, and it's such a subtle little touch. Like, it's maybe not that subtle. It's in your face enough to be noticeable for anybody who's used a phone before, but when he's got the phone up to his ear or near his ear, he keeps moving around a bunch, and it serves two purposes. One, it's meant to reinforce that Stephen Grant is a little bit like scatterbrained and a little like, whoa, where am I? Everything's... but the other thing that it does is it makes sure that the face of the phone is repeatedly coming into view. You know, you get a little of, I don't have anything with white on here. Everything's in dark mode. What have I done? Here we go. Google Maps. He's literally doing this, and then he'll turn, and then he's moving around and doing this, and you can see essentially on the screen that that's not what that's not what the screen would ever look like when you're actually on a phone call. So some portion of this persona is essentially making phantom calls in the sense that like he's basically not actually calling anybody. He's just talking into his phone and completely inventing conversations from time to time. And we see this shortly after Stephen actually gains control of the body when talking with Dr. Harrow and insisting that his mother's still alive. And so he's like, no, okay, hang on. Let's call your mother then. Let's have a quick chat with her. And he has one of the other, people at the asylum call her up, and he's like, yeah, Mrs. Grant, yeah, your son's here to talk to you. Here you go. Here's the phone. And he doesn't even reach for it. He just says that she's dead. Camera kind of closes in on the phone. You hear that dial tone. It's just like, oof. Oh, God. Okay. There's so many, like, really heavy emotional things here. I think Stephen was... Oh, no, Mark gains control back earlier on when he flips out, when essentially Stephen is telling him, like, we have to get our scales balanced. We have to walk through all of this and, like, deal with our shit so we can figure out how to get out of here and save everyone. Millions could die. Layla could die. And if you don't let us deal with this stuff, it'll all be your fault, which, like, really is kind of a huge trigger for him after everything that his mother put him through. And it's like there's just so many raw, like, really frayed kind of things. A lot of just exposed nerves, essentially, in this one. And it really was kind of a difficult watch in a lot of ways. Like, it was a really good episode, but there's so much happening here. And, in the end, we get Mark and Stephen, and their scales are just about balanced as they're finally kind of coming to grips with everything, including they wind up witnessing Mark, in the desert after having failed to save any of the archaeologists, including Layla's father, under a statue with a gun to his chin, about to pull the trigger when Khonshu, tells him, hey, you want to come work for me instead? And Stephen is like, well, this is a lot more fucked up than I thought it was before. So, like, there's a lot of, like, dark kind of stuff throughout all of this. my notes are kind of all over the place because I couldn't really. I found myself writing down way fewer notes because I was just kind of like, wow, this is a lot. This is a lot of a lot. I can't. I was struggling to pull myself away from the episode to even take real notes. But in the end, Mark and Steven, they get up on deck. The scales are just about there, but because they're not actually balanced, the unbalanced souls of the Duat climb on board to drag them down into the sands. And there's a really great moment where essentially Mark is like halfway given up in general. Like he's just kind of given up in a lot of ways, and he's just sort of like ready to just be done. And Steven has a line. He says, "Mark, you've got the," like as Mark's getting dragged away, and Steven's kind of like trying to steer the ship to sort of like throw everyone off their balance. He says, "Mark, you've got this, but if I'm you, it means I've got this too." And he grabs like a plank or something and just goes to town on a bunch of these dudes. It's really cool to see Steven actually like jumping in and really getting the work done. But in the end, Mark starts to get dragged in. Steven runs over and grabs the guy to throw him off of Mark and falls into the sand himself. The last thing we see of Steven is him turning to stone or ice or just a sand sculpture or something. But that is the end, at least presently, of Steven. Whereas the moment that happens, the scales balance and Mark turns and he's suddenly just standing in the field of reeds. So it's a real big question where we're going to wind up in this final episode. I have no idea in terms of what the episode title will be. Fist of Vengeance and Fist of Justice feel kind of like not right anymore based off of the direction that this has been taking. I don't know. Maybe it'll be like Making Peace or something. I have no idea. Or Balance. It could be Balance. I don't know. There's a lot of options there. But essentially what needs to happen is Mark needs to get out of the afterlife. Paradise even. He has to leave Paradise in order to come back. Even though, as Taweret points out, you still got 2 bullets in you. So even if you go back, you're pretty much going to die like immediately again. So I have to imagine there's going to be some level of Layla figuring out how to free Khonshu while Mark makes his way back, comes back as Moon Knight fighting Amit probably, or maybe Harrow is going to Moon Knight it up a bit, and they're going to be Moon Knight versus Moon Knight fight, since that's the MCU's favorite thing to do, is just fight your darker self. I feel like I gave this one such a beat by beat instead of kind of breaking it down into themes or anything, but there was just so much going on. It was a really well woven kind of narrative flow in this. There was a lot to take in. It was a really good episode. I give this one a 9 out of 10. It's very nearly perfect. I don't even know necessarily what I would try to improve per se, but very, very solid episode. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's still some confusing points. Like, what exactly is Dr. Harrow in there? Is he just a fragment of Mark's mind? Was there in fact a third personality in the other sarcophagus? Was that the personality responsible for killing the thugs in Egypt? There's still a couple questions that need answering among all of this, all of the rest of this. I still hold this probably could have made a better movie than a show, ultimately. All of this feels like it is going to wrap up and then be kind of final, and then we might see Moon Knight as a character in some other people's stuff. Like, my first guess would be Blade. But I don't know. Or Blade or whatever Kit Harington's, appearance winds up being somewhere in there. I don't know. I hope that he turns up in Blade, because even though we're never going to see the line, "Dracula, you big fucking nerd, where's my money?" I want it so badly. Apparently Oscar Isaac tried to drop the, "Oh, fuck, I can't believe you've done this," in the previous episode when he punched himself into the tomb but Disney obviously was not going to let that one fly in the middle of this show, even with it being what it is. I think Deadpool is like the only chance that we have in any near future of an F-bomb getting dropped in an MCU project. But yeah, no, I give this a 9 out of 10. I think this was a really solid episode. I'm sad that now I'm caught up and now I have to wait until next Wednesday to catch the last episode. But I'm excited for it. I'm actually really ready for it. It's going to be very interesting how separate this last episode is going to feel after 4 and 5 were such like a crescendo to like this really powerful kind of set of revelations. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot else to say about it for today. I think in the final, with the final episode and the final review, I'll have a lot more to say to kind of wrap things up. But that is for next week. So I think I'm going to call it here instead of rambling on and on. Thank you guys very much for watching. I would love to hear what you think about this episode and the show so far in the comments below. There goes Tonk. Yeah, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know if there's other things that you'd like me to review. I've got an idea for something I'd like to take a look at in, I don't know, the next month or two that I might do. I might watch and record reviews for what I'm thinking of before Ms. Marvel comes out, just that I'm not trying to do double duty there. But yeah, we'll see how that goes. I don't know. It's nothing set in stone until I do it. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'll catch you guys later. Have a good one, and see you for the finale next week. Bye.